Hey everybody, it is Jason Sheftel, and right now we're going to talk about Russia and China, the two big beasts basically prowling the fields of the global political landscape, right? That is basically what these two countries are. They are the big, bad wolves of the international policy sort of world, right? The whole US government is focused on a new strategy to basically try and combat these two countries, right? These are the countries that are the antagonists, the supposed antagonists to the United States, to Western Europe, to everybody. And honestly, when you see things like what's going on in Ukraine, that's not hard to believe. And it's also not wrong. But what I want to specifically talk about is whether these two countries are friends at all, in any way. And if that even makes sense as a way to talk about them, are they allies? Is there some sort of Chinese-Russian alliance anywhere in the works? Does it already exist? Because you hear about this stuff all the time.
Whoops. Let's start that again, and people who already listened will just get to hear it again. But basically, this is about China and Russia. Are these two countries, what are they, right? Are they allies? Are they not allies? Let's talk about it. So basically, the short answer is absolutely not. Russia and China have been antagonists. Variations of Russia in particular have been perhaps one of the, not even perhaps, they have been China's like worst enemy for thousands of years, right? The early Chinese states, quite literally 3,000 years ago, were fighting proto versions of, well, steppe tribes that eventually merged into the sort of Eastern Russian sort of sphere, and then eventually that became Russia. But basically, variations of people that have been north of China have been the primary Chinese antagonist. Well, basically from 1000 BC to about 1300, 14. I mean, it depends what you want to say, but really, if you consider the Qing, this has just been the perennial enemy of China. That's just the simple way to say, at least the perennial land-based enemy of China, with Japan taking the sort of sea-based maritime enemy title. And this is real, really. I mean, this is really real. Just to give people a sense of all the great countries that harmed China in the 19th century, right? This is the beginning of the so-called century of humiliation, which I should definitely do a video on to explain why this is a nonsense phrase that's propagandized and all that. But for right now, basically China says that during the 19th century, the glorious Chinese Empire, the current incarnation of the glorious Chinese Empire, the Qing dynasty, was undercut and undermined by all these foreign states. And the ones that are often singled out are in particular the British for the Opium Wars. But what the Chinese government often doesn't say is that of all the states, all of them, it was Russia, or the Russian Empire at the time, that took an enormous amount, by far the most amount of Chinese territory, right? They actually took the entire bunch of the northern Qing lands, right? I mean, basically everything above the Amur River, and that became the current border. And this is just like enormous. I mean, it's what, at least the size of Texas, the amount of land that was taken. It was an enormous part of the Qing dynasty. But, and also what happened later on with Mongolia, also kind of took even more of the, well, land away from China, basically the land that China would have wanted. But the key thing here is, well, what happened to that, right? Russia quite literally took more land from China, from Imperial China, than anybody else. Yet there's no mention of that, right? That's kind of weird. And then there's obviously the tensions that we have today, but this really goes on much deeper, right? So if there's an alliance with Russia right now in any form, which I haven't even talked about how it's, what it is composed of, what it isn't composed of, but just this idea, we have to square with the fact that the Soviet Union, which was the later version of the Russian Empire of the 19th century, that Soviet Union was initially China's great benefactor, and then also its kind of darkest nemesis during the second half of the 20th century. And we got very close to nuclear war along the Amur River in northern China during this time. And people may not know, but the last time China went to war was in the late 1970s against Vietnam. But it wasn't much of a war because something like 75% of all Chinese military troops were all thrown to the border with the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union was allied with Vietnam, not northern Vietnam, it was full Vietnam at that time, by that point. And they were so worried about war that was it. You basically had a tiny percentage of your troops that were available for Vietnam, and the whole Vietnam War was the Chinese version of the Vietnam War was a very minor kind of fake thing in a lot of ways. But this is a big reason why, because 75% of your troops were prepared for a war with Russia, or Soviet Union at the time. So you go back to the 19th century, you go back to late 20th century, you see conflict with Russia. You go back to the 19th century, you see major conflict with Russia. And you go back to the beginning of the Chinese state, and you also see conflict with countries or states or tribes or whatever you want to call it that were proto versions of Russia, right? That is what you see throughout Chinese history. So this idea that they're allied with Russia has a pretty high bar to reach, right? You just to make anybody believe that that is what's happening, you have to prove some pretty impressive stuff. You have to say that all this history is kind of irrelevant. There's new things that have changed it. Maybe it's geography, maybe it's technology, maybe it's whatever. It's changed allies, changed enemies, whatever you want to say. Got to have a really good answer for why on earth things would have changed so much that the primary antagonist of China for almost all of its history, including its modern history, is now suddenly its ally. And that did happen, right? The Soviet Union was a big ally immediately after 1949 and for the communists before 1949. So that's possible, right? So there is some way to do it. But what do we actually hear about today? Well, basically, this is a bit of an American fantasy in a lot of ways. And it's fed by both Chinese and Russian action. So a major one is definitely the defense relationship that Russia and China have had for a really long time, since the 90s primarily, since that's when the modern Russian Federation appeared after the fall of the Soviet Union. But ever since the 1990s, China has been buying up every sort of Russian defense article that they have. That's planes, that's missiles, that's ships, that's aircraft, that's everything, right? They've been getting all of it. And so they replenished and reinvigorated their entire defense industry and their military initially with massive amounts of Russian gear, right? And Russia was so desperate and poor and bankrupt, basically, that it wanted to sell and was willing to sell to anybody. But even this connection is very weak at this point. Not very weak, but incredibly weak, because China has already reverse engineered everything that it wants, right? It basically has sucked the entire milkshake of what it wants out of the Russian state's military apparatus. And the Russian state's military apparatus is crumbling right now, although obviously saying that when there's a potential war going on in Ukraine sounds a little odd. But if you look at the fact that Russia has not been able to field a major new weapon system, it hasn't been able to mass produce a major new weapon system in 15, 20 years, and doesn't look like it's going to anytime soon, there's something big going on, right? The fanciest Russian ships, planes, tanks, you name it, none of it gets mass produced. The only thing that's really still running is the missile air defense stuff, because that's so key to how Russia would have to fight any conflict anywhere. So that matters. But this whole defense relationship is really changed. And initially, we've got to remember that this wasn't like an alliance. This was a economic transaction, right? That's like saying that two people who do business with each other are allies. I mean, in a sense, they are. But in a big sense, they're also not, because allies in a political contest mean something very different, I mean. And that's something we just got to keep in mind, right? Just as a baseline, this whole idea that if you sell somebody guns, you're really allied with them, that's not entirely true, but it's also really not wrong. Like, so it matters a lot, because defense relationships tend to mean a lot of things. So when the United States sells, for example, the F-35, which I have a video on, to other countries, that implies a whole relationship, because you need to sustain that aircraft or that weapon system. Let's make it more broad, that weapon system. You have to upgrade it. You have to do maintenance to it. You have to get all the weapons that are already fielded by, right? You can't just put any weapon in any weapon system. You need to use the ones that are per program, basically, to work with it. So you have a long ongoing relationship with whoever you get your weapons from, if you're not your own weapons manufacturer. But China is by now one of the largest weapons manufacturers in the world. So that doesn't quite apply in the same way when you're talking about China. This isn't Russia selling weapons to Libya or whatever, or Syria, or whatever country you want to pick. It's a different thing. The scale of these two countries is very different. So it's a very, very different relationship. China is the bigger dog in this contest anyway. It's long since past the point where Russia is really leading it in any of these military fields, right? It's not going and buying its own. It's not going and buying Russian hypersonic missiles. It's just making its own, right? It's now making its own aircraft carrier. It's making its own stealth jet. It's making its own UAVs. It's making its own electronic jamming equipment. It's making its own rockets. It's making everything itself. in the military context, basically. So, except for a couple engines, actually, but even that is basically going to wrap up this decade. So it's going to be almost entirely done. So if you want to base this alliance thing on the weapons and the military relationships, nah, that is not enough. That doesn't qualify. So the other big area is basically energy, where Russia feeds China with oil and natural gas, like it kind of does with the rest of Europe, like it kind of does with everybody. And again, this isn't enough, right? China has such enormous needs for energy resources, particularly oil and natural gas, that it gets it from anywhere and everywhere that it can, particularly if it's cheap and it's nearby and it can't be disrupted on long maritime supply chains or interdicted in any way by the United States without like attacking multiple countries' pipelines or whatever. So that's actually really important. And obviously Russia supplies China with lots of oil and natural gas, and that's fine, but that's not, again, that's like a lot of Europe also gets its oil and natural gas from Russia, right? Does that mean Ukraine and not Ukraine, I guess not Georgia, Germany and Russia are in some sort of alliance? No, it doesn't. It means you're getting the resources you need from anywhere you can get them for the best price with basically the best deal you can get. That really doesn't qualify. And so it's just not enough. And so the other thing that you hear is basically, this is where both countries are trying to play themselves up, right? It behooves Russia to act like China's on its side because it seems far more imposing. And China, for its part, wants to have some impressive country at all on its side instead of there's just the usual suspects of like North Korea and Pakistan. That doesn't cut it to make it seem like you have any sort of clout with other countries in a real way, right? Especially compared to the United States, which has the UK and Australia and South Korea and Japan and Singapore and all these other countries basically on its team. So China has been very worried for 15 years about what exactly its team looks like, and doesn't really have much of a team. But if you could have one country that would seem impressive, Russia is one of them. But even then, this is just a very half-hearted gesture. It's directed at both internal and external propaganda. So both Chinese people like to hear, oh, wow, Russia is now on our side and we're the big dog in this relationship. That plays really well in China. And then for the Americans, well, basically for the foreign audiences in general, which is often American for this military type contest, is, well, it makes it seem more threatening. And for very unclear reasons, China, not very unclear reasons, there's good reasons why, but China continues to think that trying to make itself seem as impressive and imposing as possible is a really good idea when dealing with the United States, because the historical position in Chinese history is basically to just be as impressive as possible, and you very much intimidate all your rivals, opponents, all that kind of thing. And it's also much better to threaten than to actually have to go down on the mat, right? And so anyone you can threaten and not have to actually do any sort of aggression towards actually a win, right? You have to put on a big front, but you don't actually have to pay the actual cost of real combat or war or conflict. So that's a good thing. China's always looking to do that. It would much rather have Taiwan just join the fold out of pure fear and intimidation, much rather have all sorts of other countries around it just fold and not try and compete or threaten or do anything against China. But obviously this isn't the way the world works. But we're getting to just the core of this, which is basically China and Russia, right? Is there even a basis for these countries to be allied with each other in any sort of real way? I mean, here's the thing that is kind of the dark secret of all this, is that, like I said at the beginning, China, a lot of Russia's land belonged to China just in the 19th century, not too long ago, and the Russian Empire took it. And the truth is, there's very few Russians even there. If you go above Manchuria and Inner Mongolia and Mongolia, there's like no Russians in this region. There's basically just natural resources. And you can't really have much of an alliance. This is actually a threat to Russia. I mean, China would like that land. I mean, there's no reason it wouldn't want it. And obviously there's reasons why you don't want to get it and all this kind of stuff for why these countries never went to war and why there's big problems with them. But Russia's whole heartland, all the people, all of the everything of Russia is around the Volga River and basically it's in Western Russia and near Eastern Europe. And that is where Russia is. That's where the Russian spirit and soul and history and culture and language and everything is and developed. Everything else to the east is just kind of taking what nobody wanted, and then kind of what the rest of the Chinese couldn't keep. But there's not much that Russia and China even have in terms of any sort of connection at all. Like, this isn't like Canada and the United States, where all of Canada, 80% of Canada's population is basically 100 miles from the U.S. border, or some number like that. It's a remarkable number. And they're just right up on the border, right above the United States. There's a deep connection to basically between every Canadian province, and every neighboring American province. There's more connections that direction than there are between the Canadian provinces themselves. In China, there's just a bunch of empty land with some natural resources and some pipelines and a couple other material extraction sort of industries, and that's it, right? There's nothing there. Russia can't actually help China at all in any way for any of its conflicts with any of the countries around it. I guess to the east of it, you could say. It literally can't help with any of them. It can basically just continue to give China some weapons and some energy and get in on its plans, crazy crackpot plans to put up a moon base or something with Russia. I mean, even the Russian space industry isn't too useful anymore. China's probably better off just doing it entirely itself on the moon, if that's what it wants to do, than getting Russia to join in, because Russia's space industry is so decrepit, there's almost no point. That's kind of what the Europeans learned when they did this ExoMars mission, which is going to basically fly within a year or something. They did a long collaboration with Russia because it supposedly had such a great space industry. It took like 20 years to get something done, and it's all a disaster. We'll see how it'll go. But there's basically no reason to even team up with Russia in most ways, because it doesn't have much that you want, right? If you don't want natural resources and you're on the other side of Russia, the eastern side of Russia, there's very little reason to do any of this. And a lot of it is really posturing by these two countries. And deep down, even below reasons or beneath the idea that there's reasons for them to be allies, there's very good reasons for them to be long-term enemies. And just the basic history I laid out at the beginning of this, where Russia and China have fought in various forms, various incarnations of both states for so long, it boggles the mind. And really, the only time this changed was for a brief period between basically from 1949 to like 1956-7. That's it. Like less than 1 decade, where the official Chinese state and the official Soviet Russian state were like allies. That is about it. And that's not a great, I mean, that's a blip, right? That is the exception that proves the rule. And I think with that, I'll just leave it at that, right? That is the exception that proves the rule. And unfortunately, we have a lot of recent history in our brains, and we don't have a lot of the rest of the past. And I think it was Winston Churchill who said, the farther back you can see, the farther back you look, the farther forward you can see. And so with that, we should keep that in mind, basically, that the Russia and the China connection is really old, and most of it hasn't been all that pleasant or collaborative in any sort of way. And betting that it's going to stay that way or be that way at all in the coming years isn't a great bet. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. Please like, please subscribe, please put on notifications. Or actually don't. Whatever you feel like doing, right? If you like these videos, do it. If you don't like them, don't do it. But with that,